Good morning. I'm Hassan Giordano, and this is your DMV Daily Dose for Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020.
It's currently clear and 23 degrees in Baltimore. Expect partly cloudy skies starting tonight. Today's high will be 39 degrees, and the low will be 23.
The Maryland's men's basketball team seemed to be going through the motions in the first half of Tuesday night's game against Northwestern. 17th ranked Terps were faced with a 15-point deficit in the first half and down 14 at halftime, matching its biggest halftime deficit of the season before Maryland was energized in the second half by sophomore forward Jalen Smith and rallied to beat the Wildcats 77-66. Smith finished with a career-high 25 points, with 21 coming in the second half, and grabbed 11 rebounds to lead his team to its first road victory of the season. Fiscal analysts encouraged the General Assembly's budget to do more this year to address the state's structural deficit, particularly before education reform or an economic downturn could widen the shortfall, says a new Maryland Matters article. Republican Governor Larry Hogan's $47.9 billion proposed budget includes changes to state spending and revenue to close the cash shortfall, but Department of Legislative Service analysts say the proposal leaves a structural deficit of about $37 million. David Romans, a fiscal and policy coordinator for the Department of Legislative Services Office of Policy Analysts, said that Hogan's proposed budget is fairly sparse in terms of new initiatives, but does include some cuts that the General Assembly's Democratic majority will find controversial. However, Romans said that a marquee issue for Democrats this session, implementing the Kirwan Commission's funding recommendations for a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar education reform plan, will have no impact on the structural deficit for the 2021 and 2022 fiscal years. Quote, in the near term, you can pretty comfortably make this happen. But as we get further out, it's going to become more challenging to fund, Roman said. By 2023, a modest deficit of $52 million forms as a result of increased Kirwan Commission spending based on current spending and revenue projections. By 2025, however, using those same figures, the Kirwan reforms could add $573 million in additional spending that will drive up the structural deficit to more than $1.6 billion. Now, assuming that a slowdown would add 50,000 people to the state's Medicaid rolls and affect other state spending patterns, the Department of Legislative Services estimated that the structural deficit could increase to more than $2.2 billion in 2025. At some point, we're going to have to see a slowdown in the economy, and if we're running a really high structural gap before you hit a slowdown, it becomes a true crisis to try to balance the budget, Roman said. In other perennial issues, lawmakers will decide whether to go along with Hogan's proposed increase to boost scholarships to provide private schools from $3.4 million currently to more than $10 million in 2021, and how to include legislative bond initiatives in the state's capital budget, where Hogan set no funding aside for the annual spending. Now, the Baltimore Sun is reporting that when Harford County Sheriff deputies responded to the 4500 block of Oak Ridge Drive on Tuesday night for a report of animal cruelty, they were fired upon by a man holed up in his home, and a neighbor was hit by a bullet. Colonel William Davis of the sheriff's office said deputies responded to the rural street at approximately 7 o'clock at night. There, a suspect came out of the house and started firing rounds in their direction. Patrol deputies took cover and established a perimeter, warning neighbors that the man was firing from inside his house and refusing to leave. At least one bullet hit a police cruiser as well as a neighbor who was standing outside. The neighbor was transported to a hospital in York, Pennsylvania with injuries that were not considered life-threatening. Now, negotiators were able to contact the man on the phone and persuade him to come outside. By the end of the ordeal, deputies had not fired a single bullet. The Baltimore Sun's Luke Broadwater is reporting that the Baltimore police said Tuesday that they are investigating whether officers violated departmental policy last fall during a traffic stop of mayoral candidate Thiru Vignarajah. The investigation will include whether a sergeant acted appropriately in turning off a body-worn camera during the stop, Baltimore police spokesman Matt Jablow said. We have referred this case to the Public Integrity Bureau to investigate whether there was any policy violations related to the stop. It is too early for BPD to make a determination without a complete investigation of the officer's conduct, Jablow said. Now, the September 26th traffic stop started with a patrol officer pulling Vignarajah over at night in East Baltimore after the officer found a problem with Vignarajah's vehicle registration. We reported on the initial stop and what transpired as reported on by The Sun in yesterday's DMV Daily Dose. However, we have since recently been informed of and read through a more thorough examination of that stop, an incident written by independent journalist Justine Barron that you can read over at www.thesuitorfiles.com. I'm your man, Mr. Politics, and this has been your DMV Daily Dose for Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020. For more information on articles that I've mentioned, just go on over to that website at www.dmvdaily.news.